A man never imagined how far his ideals would take him, but this night changed everything. Barney's breathing grew heavier behind the Janis mask, his fists clenched as he pushed through the chaotic Halloween party. Guests screamed, dodging flying glass and tumbling over tables. Broken bottles and crimson stains on the lavish carpet blurred into a symbol of rebellion in Barney's mind. He no longer saw the glittering costumes, the extravagance. He saw the faces of corrupt leaders, the very system he had fought against for so long. With the jagged remains of a champagne bottle in his grip, Barney dragged a wealthy man dressed as Dracula to the floor, ignoring the gasps of the crowd. The luxury around him was nothing but a cruel facade. His eyes locked on Justin, standing frozen, gun in hand, disbelief in his expression. Barney laughed, low and bitter. This was no party, no celebration. This was a confrontation long overdue. As Justin raised his gun, Barney yanked a terrified woman into his grasp, pressing the broken bottle to her throat. "Talking is never enough," he growled, his voice cold. "Sometimes you have to act." The party that began with laughter now simmered with horror as guests stumbled toward the exit, fleeing the blood-stained ballroom, leaving Barney and Justin in a deadly standoff. A few days before the Halloween party, Barney was just an activist, not knowing how much his life was about to change. Let's go back to the beginning of the story. Barney Brooke stared at his phone screen, watching the video clip he had repeatedly viewed over the past few days. A young man, Janis Kalnins, a Latvian activist fighting against injustice, flickered on the screen. This young fighter believed that injustice could only be stopped through violence, carrying the ideology that corrupt power must be destroyed with harsh and radical actions. Corruption, which had spread through every corner of government officials to the parliament, could no longer be halted by mere criticism and demonstrations. Strong, real action, and if necessary, radical measures had to be taken immediately. Before Janis could carry out his plans, he was arrested and shot dead in Karasta prison in 1951, just days before his wedding. Janis then became a symbol of resistance against the corrupt regime and brutal oppression. Janis' story touched Barney on a personal level. Even though separated by decades and thousands of kilometers, he felt connected to the brave figure of Janis. To Barney, Janis represented the idea that the fight against tyranny knows no bounds of time or place. As Janis smiled coldly in the documentary video before his execution, Barney suddenly felt drawn to visit the Karasta prison hotel, the place where everything ended for the Latvian activist. He wanted to set foot in Karasta prison and feel the same sensations that Janis Kalnins, now his sudden idol, had experienced. In his small New Jersey apartment, Barney felt the same fire burning inside him. Barney wasn't the type of young man who was easily content with the comforts of life. At the age of 27, he had already become an activist, fighting for equality and against corruption. Born in New Jersey to a working-class family, he grew up in an environment where social injustice was always visible. This is where his dedication was born: to defend the marginalized and to fight against the system he saw as broken and unfair. On a cold evening in a small cafe in downtown New Jersey, Barney solidified his plan to visit the city of Liepāja, Latvia. To him, this wasn't just a vacation. It was a spiritual journey, a chance to dive into the history that had shaped a fighter. More than that, it was an opportunity to experience firsthand the chilling atmosphere of the former prison, now transformed into the Karasta Prison Hotel. According to Barney's research on the internet, he discovered that the Karasta Prison Hotel resembles more of a haunted relic from the past than an actual hotel. The gloomy stone walls, which once echoed the screams and suffering of political prisoners, have now been transformed into hotel rooms that guests can experience. The building, originally a naval fortress of the Russian Empire, and later one of the most feared prisons in Latvia, has now been restored as a hotel. Barney was particularly interested in the room where Janis stayed before his execution. He felt chills imagining the small, narrow space that used to be Janis Kalnins' prison cell. Karasta is unlike any other hotel. Here guests are not treated as guests, but as prisoners. From the moment they step in, they are required to follow strict rules. Prison uniforms, lights that never turn off, and a grueling routine are all designed to recreate the terrifying atmosphere of a Soviet-era military prison. Every guest is instructed to obey the commands of the guards, who play their roles so seriously that it's hard to distinguish between the game and reality. Barney booked the exact cell where Janis was once held. A dark, windowless room with only a rusty iron bed and an old bucket used as a toilet. The presence of Janis and other prisoners seemed to linger in every corner. Although he knew this was just part of the experience, carefully crafted to feel authentic, Barney felt an intense emotional pull. In that room, history felt real. Cold sweat began to run down his back, even though he hadn't set foot in the place yet. For most people, staying at Karasta prison might sound like a crazy idea, but not for Barney. This was a quest to understand the meaning of struggle, to grasp how Janis Kalnins held on to his ideals until his dying breath. What was it like to be a fighter standing against a powerful regime? How did it feel knowing that every step you took, every word you spoke, could be your last? Barney stepped into Karasta prison, his breath slightly held. A cold wind brushed his face as he passed through the creaking iron gate, greeted by the towering, grimy, moss-covered stone walls. The gray Latvian sky added to the gloomy atmosphere, almost giving its blessing to the eerie aura surrounding the place. Something immediately seeped into him. It wasn't just the physical cold, but something deeper, like a faint whisper from the past clinging to every corner of the building. As Barney entered the reception area, there were no friendly smiles like in other hotels. The staff behind the tall counter stared at him coldly, dressed in a gray military uniform with a worn-out badge on his chest. He spoke with a firm, almost emotionless voice, explaining the rules that must be followed during the stay. "Here, you are not a guest. You are a prisoner," he said briefly. Barney nodded slowly, feeling a chill running down his spine. The check-in process felt more like a detention registration than a hotel welcome. There were no friendly forms or warm greetings, just strict warnings about the routines to be followed. A strict sleeping schedule, no access to phones, and meals delivered through a slot in the door, just as the prisoners once received. "You must follow every instruction, or there will be consequences," the staff added, handing Barney a worn-out uniform he had to wear during his stay. The uniform was heavy, with a damp smell as if it had never fully dried from the sweat of previous prisoners. A pair of handcuffs hung beside the desk, reinforcing the idea that playing the role of a prisoner here was no joke. After a brief orientation, Barney was escorted to his room, or rather his cell. A staff member, playing the role of a guard, led him through narrow, dark corridors that seemed to stretch endlessly. The pale gray walls of the corridor were marked with fading scribbles, written by who knows whom, but they seemed filled with the desperate cries of former prisoners. Each step of the guard's heavy boots on the cold concrete floor echoed, creating a haunting rhythm that echoed in Barney's mind. The further he walked, the tighter the pressure grew in his chest. The sound of the wind slipping through the cracks of the small iron windows sounded like faint whispers, as if the place had a soul that refused to die. Barney began to feel a shift, not just physically, but mentally. The idealism that had fueled his passion was now confronted by the brutal reality of the history that lingered here. This was the prison where Janis Kalnins, the figure he had admired, took his last breath. How strong had Janis been to bear the weight of this isolation? How ready had he been to face his inevitable end? When the guard opened the door to his cell, Barney stood still. The small room was even more cramped than he had imagined. There was no window, just grimy, damp walls that looked as if they were ready to collapse. A rusted metal bed without a mattress was squeezed into a corner, along with an old bucket that served as a toilet. The dim light hanging overhead barely lit the room, only deepening the darkness that seemed to settle in every corner. When the guard slammed the door shut behind him, Barney felt as though he had been completely cut off from the outside world. This, he thought, is where Janis once sat, lay down, perhaps contemplating the death that awaited him. Barney sat on the cold, rough bed, feeling his heart beat faster. This place had a strange power, shifting his perspective on freedom and struggle. It wasn't just a physical prison, it was a prison for the mind and soul. As time crawled slowly in the prison, Barney began to feel more connected to the spirit of the struggle he had admired from afar. Now, he wasn't just an activist who admired a fighter. He was part of that history, living in it, experiencing what Janis might have felt. The silence, the fear, the uncertainty of the future, but also the unbreakable determination. The sound of footsteps in the corridor, the whisper of wind sneaking through small cracks, all added to the drama unfolding in his mind. Every second in this place brought Barney closer to a deep understanding of the price one must pay to uphold their ideals. The days passed like an unending nightmare. Sleep was brief, the food was nothing but hard bread and watery soup, and the interactions with the hotel staff or guards felt like a slow, creeping terror that seeped into his soul, emotions, and blood. Before checkout time, Barney slowly made his way to the souvenir shop at the corner of Karasta Prison, a small room filled with objects bearing dark memories. He walked between shelves displaying history books, Soviet-era propaganda posters, and various replicas of items once used by prisoners. Every item seemed to have a spirit of its own, pulling Barney back to a terrifying past full of suffering. He tried to take a deep breath, but the air in the room felt heavy, as if it still held traces of the pain that lingered in the walls. Suddenly, his eyes fell on a rubber mask lying on one of the shelves. There was something familiar about the face behind the mask. At a glance, the face resembled someone he had been studying for days. His heart pounded. Barney approached the shelf and carefully lifted the mask, feeling the cold rubber texture under his fingers. It was the face of Janis Kalnins, the same face he had seen in the documentary on YouTube, the face that had accompanied his long research on the struggle and tragic death of the young Latvian activist. "Is this really Janis's face?" Barney asked in a hoarse voice to the shopkeeper, who stood behind the cashier counter, staring at Barney with a blank expression. The shopkeeper nodded. "Yes, this is a replica of Janis Kalnins' face, a hero of the common people in Latvia. This face has become a symbol of resistance and bravery. Many people wear it at festivals or memorial events to honor his struggle." Hearing this explanation, Barney felt a cold shiver run down his spine. It was a feeling he couldn't quite define, somewhere between admiration and fear. Janis was a figure who had inspired his ideals, but wearing his face, it felt like bringing history to life, reigniting the spirit of the struggle that once filled this prison. It was as though, by wearing the mask, Barney could feel a small part of the fear, hope, and resilience that Janis had experienced in his final moments. Barney suddenly remembered the Halloween party that Justin was hosting in a few days. Justin, his college friend, was now a politician, following in the footsteps of his father, a senator. The party would be filled with influential people, successful business owners, politicians, and others whom Barney often saw as part of the systemic problems he had long opposed. Thinking about it, Barney felt a sudden urge to wear this mask, to bring Janis's spirit to the party. It would be like making a statement without words, a silent protest against the luxury and superficiality he might encounter there. He imagined walking into the grand party amidst the glittering lights and pounding music while wearing Janis's mask. The smiling, laughing faces behind extravagant costumes would pause for a moment when they saw Janis's cold face among them. Barney could sense how symbolic it would be. He, carrying the weight of resistance, standing among people who often didn't care about the fate of the marginalized. He could imagine the whispers behind his back, the sudden discomfort when the guests realized that the mask wasn't just part of a spooky costume. It was the face of a fighter who had died battling oppression. Oppression that they might have created, or at the very least, allowed to continue. Beneath the mask, Barney was no longer himself. He was a representative of all the forgotten and oppressed people crushed by a corrupt system, upheld by people like Justin and his father. That feeling sent a rush through Barney's veins. There was a sense of pride when he decided to purchase the mask. With a firm movement, Barney took out his wallet and paid at the register. The shopkeeper handed the mask to him with a brief nod, without a word. Barney felt the weight of the mask in his hands. It felt heavier than just rubber. It was the weight of history and the spirit of resistance that he was carrying home. As Barney left the souvenir shop, his steps felt lighter, but his mind was racing. A piece of history was now in his hands, ready to be taken into a different world, to a Halloween party that seemed harmless but was full of irony. That party would be the stage where Janis's spirit and Barney's idealism would unite, confronting the very reality he had been fighting against. Barney walked out of Karasta prison with heavier steps, not due to physical exhaustion, but from the mental weight he carried. He felt like he had undergone a spiritual journey, not just a study of Janis Kalnins' history, but a deeper exploration of himself. In this terrifying hotel, he had found something deeper, resilience born out of fear and unshakable belief, even in the darkest of times. The sky over Liepāja seemed brighter as the plane carrying Barney slowly cut through the horizon, heading back to New Jersey, though the sun was still hidden behind thick clouds. Through the airplane window, Barney stared blankly, his eyes searching the distant horizon as if trying to grasp something he could never fully hold. In his heart, a whirlwind of emotions swirled, intersecting with flashes of memories from his journey in Latvia. One thing he knew for certain, he would never be the same person again. Something inside him had changed, and he could feel it like a slow but sure shift creeping into his mind, altering his view of the world and of struggle. His admiration for Janis Kalnins, which had started as simple respect for a people's hero, had now grown into something deeper, more personal. It wasn't just Janis's fight that moved him, but the ideology behind it. The belief that the injustice trapping so many lives could only be fought with true courage, and sometimes with violence. Barney felt a growing internal conflict. On one hand, he had always been an activist who believed in the power of words, peaceful actions, and diplomacy to fight injustice. But on the other hand, his experience at Karasta had opened his eyes to a harsher reality. Janis Kalnins, a young man living under tyranny, didn't just resist with words. He and people like him were forced to take up arms, mobilize the masses, and confront the regime in a more radical way. Janis' story had planted a seed of doubt in Barney's long-held belief. Was it really possible to bring about change through peaceful protest alone? In his seat, Barney gripped the armrests tightly, closing his eyes for a moment, trying to process the thoughts racing through his mind. Throughout the journey home, he kept thinking about how he had felt limited by peaceful methods, which now seemed slow and ineffective in his eyes. In a world where systemic injustice seemed so deeply rooted, was there really any way other than a tougher, uncompromising resistance? The upcoming Halloween party in New Jersey, the one Justin was hosting, began to play in his mind. Before this trip, he might have attended wearing Janis' mask as a silent symbol, a quiet protest amidst the party's superficiality. But now, there was something more significant than just symbolism. The mask was no longer just a replica of a hero's face. It was a call to action. Images of Janis kept flashing in his thoughts. His cold expression before execution, and his resolve not to bow to power. Would Janis have been satisfied with mere peaceful protests? Have great changes ever come without sacrifice? As Barney reflected on the world today, filled with endless corruption and injustice, he felt something different ignite within him. Janis's view on resistance started to make sense. Barney reached for the bag beneath his seat. Inside it was the Janis mask he had bought at Karasta. He slowly pulled it out, examining it closely. That face, though made of rubber, felt so alive. Behind the faint smile etched into Janis's face, Barney could feel the suffering and courage that had shaped him. A quiet voice inside whispered, strengthening a resolve that had been buried under the peaceful idealism he had long embraced. Barney stared at the mask for a long time, imagining the moment he would wear it at Justin's party. He no longer pictured himself as a quiet guest, protesting silently. Instead, he saw himself as someone embodying a more real spirit of resistance. Amidst the luxury and hollow laughter, he would wear Janis's face, not to play a role, but to represent everything Janis had fought for. Barney imagined standing there, facing the politicians, business leaders, and powerful people who often turned a blind eye to injustice. Would they feel uncomfortable seeing that face? Would they realize that Barney's presence wasn't just a costume, but a threat to their hypocritical way of life? Perhaps, Barney thought, it was time to stop playing by the rules set by the corrupt. Janis didn't wait for the system to change. He fought back by any means necessary. And now, Barney found himself increasingly aligned with the idea that sometimes violence might be the only way to truly break down tyranny. The plane began its descent toward New Jersey, and the city lights became visible from the sky. Barney felt a slight tension in his stomach, not from the flight, but from something deeper, a radical change within him that he knew could never be undone. Inside, the idealism he once held so firmly had started to shift. This journey, his encounter with Janis, even if only through memories and history at Karasta prison, had changed everything. Barney closed his eyes and took a deep breath. When he returned home, he would no longer be just an activist fighting for justice. He was now someone who had come to understand that sometimes change requires more than just words. The Halloween party finally arrived. Barney put on the costume and the Janis mask he had bought in Latvia. As he looked at his reflection in the mirror before leaving, something felt different. It was as if he wasn't just wearing a mask, but embodying the spirit of a fighter that had now seeped into him. His steps felt heavy, but his resolve was firm. Tonight, he wasn't just Barney Brooke, a young activist from New Jersey. Tonight, he was Janis Kalnins, a figure who lived to fight injustice, even if it meant dying for his beliefs. His car turned into the elite neighborhood, which felt like another world. Giant trees lined the streets, and grand houses stood behind tall fences, each resembling a fortress, separating their inhabitants from the real world. Here, many chose to turn a blind eye to any form of injustice, pretending that their world was perfect. Barney felt a mixture of anger and irony swirling within him. A Halloween party in a place like this, it all felt like a grand charade. As Barney approached Justin's sprawling mansion, luxury cars lined the driveway. Lamborghinis, Porsches, Bentleys, all names that reminded Barney of the ever-growing divide between those who had everything and those who had nothing. This is where the party takes place, among the people who control the system, who talk about policy but rarely care about the common folk trapped within it, Barney thought to himself. Barney stepped out of his car and walked toward the front door. There, Justin greeted him with a wide smile, wearing an elegant black suit paired with a wolf mask, as if he had only half-heartedly tried to embrace the Halloween spirit. "Barney, you finally made it!" Justin exclaimed, his voice filled with excitement, though to Barney, that excitement felt hollow. Barney gave a brief nod and greeted a few other guests. They were all dressed in elaborate costumes, ghosts, vampires, demons, but something felt off about every detail. The costumes were carefully designed and expensive, not the cheap fabric typically worn at costume parties. This was Halloween, high-class style. Silk gowns that hugged bodies perfectly, crocodile leather jackets, and diamond accessories sparkling under the chandelier lights made the atmosphere feel more like a luxurious cocktail party than a Halloween gathering. The air was filled with the scent of perfumes costing hundreds, if not thousands of dollars, blending with the sounds of laughter and the clinking of crystal glasses. The room was dimly lit, illuminated only by large candles in the corners and golden-hued hanging lights. Soft jazz music played from hidden speakers, adding a formal, almost arrogant vibe. The guests' laughter rang out loud, but without warmth, forced laughter, part of the social etiquette. In the corners of the room, small groups gathered, discussing topics like investments, stocks, and political influence. Barney recognized a few faces, well-known senators, some powerful business moguls, and public figures he often saw on television. They all laughed, toasted, and conversed, but Barney could feel the deep divide between them and the reality of life. There was an arrogance in the way they moved, in how they casually sipped their champagne, as if the world outside didn't matter. Every burst of laughter seemed like a mockery of the people they had ignored for so long. People like Janis Kalnins, who fought and died resisting the very injustices created by people like them. Barney chose to stand in a corner, his eyes sharply observing the guests' behavior. A middle-aged man, dressed as Dracula, with gold-plated teeth, laughed heartily, while holding a young woman in a red gown who looked more like a film noir actress than a spooky witch. On the other side of the room, a woman dressed as a zombie queen gracefully ate caviar, her fingers adorned with diamond rings that gleamed under the candlelight. Barney felt a tightness in his chest as he watched all of this unfold. They were celebrating luxury, even at a party meant to honor darkness and fear. This wasn't Halloween. It was a game of power and money that they played every day. The masks they wore didn't hide who they truly were. Instead, they highlighted how they used false identities in real life to stay in control, to remain on top. They wore masks every day, masks of fake smiles, masks of power, and they thought it was all just a game. But for Barney, this was far more serious. Behind the Janus mask he wore, his anger began to boil. His eyes locked on Justin, laughing with a group of senators and officials, raising their crystal glasses high, toasting to victory, wealth, and the power they held. They didn't know, or perhaps didn't care, that people outside were suffering because of the decisions they made behind closed doors. Barney's anger grew hotter. Behind the mask of Janus, he felt as though he had become the fighter himself. Every fake smile in the room fueled a burning hatred inside him. Janus had fought against people like these, those who saw human lives as nothing more than numbers and statistics, who treated the common people as tools to enrich themselves. Barney clenched his fists beneath his black cloak, feeling adrenaline surge through his body. This party wasn't just a Halloween celebration. It was a representation of everything wrong in the world he had been fighting against. "Drink, Barney?" Justin suddenly appeared beside him, raising a champagne glass with a wide smile that seemed genuine on the surface. But behind the Janus mask, Barney saw the smile as a taunt, a reflection of the corrupt and selfish system he despised. Barney stared at Justin from behind the mask. Time seemed to slow down. A strong urge rose within him to do something more than just being a passive observer at this party. Barney knew that tonight wasn't just about Halloween. It was about a larger struggle, one that might need to be taken further than he had originally imagined. That night, under Janus' mask, Barney felt he wasn't just wearing a costume for Halloween. He was carrying a message, a warning. In his mind, he could almost hear Janis Kalnins whisper, "Sometimes we must force change in ways they don't expect." Barney felt the call growing stronger, like a voice whispering in the darkness, thundering with every beat of his heart. In an instant, the spirit of Janus, the defiant figure against injustice, seemed to take hold of him, pushing him beyond the limits of logic and awareness. Behind the rubber mask of Janus, his face felt hot, his thoughts spinning wildly. With steady but anger-fueled steps, he moved through the guests at the Halloween party. At first, his actions seemed like part of the party's entertainment. Barney, moving quickly and with purpose, began approaching guests one by one. When he suddenly grabbed the collar of a wealthy man dressed as a vampire and shoved him to the floor, laughter erupted. Everyone thought it was just part of the Halloween fun, a theatrical stunt to spice things up. But the look in Barney's eyes, hidden behind Janis' mask, held something far darker, something unnoticed by the crowd around him. Laughter and jokes slowly turned to confusion as Barney continued his relentless movement, pushing, hitting, and throwing other guests against the walls. A crystal glass slipped from a woman's hand, shattering into pieces on the floor, breaking the brief silence that had started to settle over the room. Eyes widened as guests realized this was no Halloween prank. The first scream pierced the air as one guest crashed hard to the ground, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead, mixing with spilled champagne. Barney, as if no longer himself, moved with an unexpected speed and strength. Each blow seemed fueled by pent-up rage, shaking the bodies of guests who were used to a life of comfort and luxury. Behind the Janis mask, Barney was no longer just a guest at the party. He had become an unstoppable symbol of resistance. In his mind, he was fighting tyranny, not merely a group of rich partygoers laughing in a mansion. The once lively room, filled with laughter and casual conversation, shifted into chaos. Broken glasses littered the floor, red wine spilled like blood, staining the expensive carpet. Guests started running and screaming, trying to escape the now terrifying figure of Barney, who had transformed into a shadowy force that couldn't be stopped. Cries of fear filled the air as bodies hit the floor, struck by flying bottles and shards of glass hurled by Barney. Some guests lay unconscious, blood seeping from their heads, as the once glamorous party descended into horror. A few people tried to calm Barney down, approaching him cautiously with their hands raised, hoping they could stop the rampage they thought was still under control. But Barney's gaze from behind the Janis mask grew emptier, as if he was no longer the one in control of his actions. Every time someone got close, he shoved them back with surprising force, sending them stumbling into tables full of food and drinks, which spilled in a chaotic mess. Now the once arrogant and smug faces that had been filled with laughter turned to expressions of fear. The guests, who were usually so confident in their lives of luxury and high social status, now looked like frightened children caught in the middle of a nightmare. They ran frantically, colliding with one another in a desperate attempt to escape the chaos. Panic-filled screams echoed through the room, replacing the jokes and laughter that had dominated just moments earlier. The Halloween party, meant to be a glamorous affair, had transformed into a night of terror, resembling the true horror of uncontrollable rebellion rather than just a celebration of masks and costumes. Meanwhile, Barney continued moving through the crowd, showing no sign of stopping, his every move driven by an unstoppable fury. He smashed champagne bottles, stabbing some of the guests, many of whom he recognized as corrupt politicians, in the stomach. Finally, a few guests managed to reach the exit, sprinting into the dark yard, gasping for air. Inside the mansion, the sounds of screams mixed with the crashing of objects and shattering glass. Outside, some of them stood frozen, unable to comprehend what had just happened. This Halloween night, inside that grand mansion, had turned into a night of terror they would never forget. In the midst of the chaos, Barney paused for a moment, standing still in the wrecked room. His breathing was heavy behind the Janis mask, and deep in his heart, a question arose. Was this what Janis would have wanted, or was this merely a reflection of his own long-buried rage? Suddenly, a loud sound interrupted the chaos. Justin stood tall in the center of the room, pointing a gun directly at Barney, his eyes filled with deep anger. "Stop, Barney!" Justin shouted, his voice shaking between panic and anger. His face was flushed and his breath was quick. This was no longer the lavish party he had under control. It had turned into a nightmare. In one sharp breath, he had lost control of the night that was supposed to be a celebration. Barney's face, hidden behind the Janis mask, was no less fierce. His eyes, obscured behind the mask, burned like embers ready to ignite at any moment. Though his real face was covered, every movement of his body was filled with tension and simmering rage. In an instant, the once chaotic party fell into silence, as if everyone in the room was holding their breath, watching two figures on the brink of an explosion. The softly swaying chandeliers, disturbed by earlier panic, now felt like stage lights illuminating two actors in a scene of life and death. The silhouettes of Justin and Barney stood clear under the dim light, while the other guests, who had been scrambling for an exit, were now frozen, trapped between fear and disbelief. In a split second, Barney reacted. Seeing Justin pointing a gun at him, his primal instincts took over. With his left hand, he grabbed a woman standing nearby, pulling her roughly towards him. Her scream shattered the tense silence, her eyes wide in terror, shocked to find herself a hostage in the midst of this horrific Halloween night. Her body trembled, but Barney didn't care. In his mind, he needed something to shield him from Justin's gun. His right hand reached for a champagne bottle lying on the table beside him. In one swift, unhesitant motion, he smashed the bottle against the edge of the table, breaking it with a sharp and brutal sound. The jagged glass sparkled under the lights, turning into a deadly weapon in his grip. Holding the woman tightly, Barney pressed the broken bottle to her throat, ready to act if Justin made the wrong move. Justin's face tensed. Though anger still burned in his eyes, doubt began to creep into his mind. His hand, gripping the gun, trembled slightly. He hadn't expected his old friend Barney to transform into this. "Barney, let her go!" Justin shouted, his voice louder now, but there was a hint of pleading beneath his anger. The woman held hostage by Barney sobbed, tears streaming down her now wet face. Her cries echoed through the large room, causing the hearts of the remaining guests to race faster. The atmosphere grew even more tense, with every second feeling like a ticking time bomb, ready to explode at any moment. Barney did not loosen his grip. Behind Janis' mask, his gaze was locked on Justin. In his mind, Justin's face no longer resembled that of an old friend. He had become a symbol of everything wrong with the system, a man like his father, a politician who cared only about power and money. Tonight, Barney felt like he was standing as a representative of the oppressed, of those who had been forgotten. The woman in his arms screamed again, her body shaking violently under Barney's hold, but he didn't care. He saw only Justin, his eyes burning with simmering hatred. Justin grew increasingly uneasy, his finger twitching on the trigger. His breath quickened, and his eyes darted around the room, searching for a way out of the spiraling situation. The remaining guests watched in horror, not daring to move, terrified they might become the next victim. The screams from outside had died down, leaving only the heavy breathing and the crunch of broken glass beneath Barney's feet. Finally, after what felt like a lifetime, Justin spoke again, this time with a more assertive tone. "Barney, this is madness. Let her go, and we can talk, we can work this out." But Barney let out a short laugh, a cold, hollow sound, as if from someone who had already abandoned reason. "Talk?" Barney asked bitterly, his eyes never leaving Justin. "Talking is never enough. Janis knew that, and now I know it too." Justin's grip on the gun tightened, and sweat dripped from his forehead. The air grew hotter, more charged, and unpredictable. Every passing second seemed to bring them closer to a point of no return, the climax of all the anger Barney had long held inside, a rage that could no longer be contained by mere words. Unbeknownst to Barney, in the dim light that almost swallowed the entire room, a shadow moved swiftly from behind. Before Barney could react, a hard blow struck the back of his neck, sending his head forward with a loud thud. He collapsed to the floor, unconscious, his body limp. The woman who had been in his grip scrambled free, gasping for breath as she leapt away. Meanwhile, Justin stood frozen, his face downcast in the darkness, staring at the floor with eyes filled with sadness and confusion. Outside, the sound of police sirens grew louder, breaking the stillness of the night. Red and blue lights flashed along the driveway leading to Justin's mansion, adding to the dramatic atmosphere of a night that had turned into a nightmare. The guests, who had once gathered with laughter and expensive drinks, now spilled out of the mansion, their faces pale and clothes disheveled. Panic-filled screams and hushed whispers surrounded them as the police quickly secured the scene. 2 police officers handcuffed Barney and led him away from the mansion. His breathing was heavy, his eyes stared straight ahead, but behind the Janis mask that still covered his face, all desire to fight had drained away. His face was etched with exhaustion and emptiness, as though all the anger he had carried had been released in one tragic night. He knew there was no turning back. Legal consequences awaited him as the price for pursuing his ideals, inspired by Janis Kalnins, the Latvian activist. The police escorted Barney to the patrol car, locking the door with a loud click, while paramedics rushed around the mansion, helping the injured and ensuring no lives had been lost that night. Justin's once grand and luxurious home had now become the site of a tragedy that would not be easily forgotten. The spotlight from police vehicles illuminated the chaotic garden, littered with broken glass and champagne bottles, marking the remnants of a night meant to be filled with luxury, but turned into disaster. Meanwhile, across the country, news of the Halloween incident spread rapidly. Live broadcasts from news cameras began flooding television screens and social media feeds. Amateur video clips taken by party guests showed moments of chaos, screams, shouts, and footage of Barney wearing the Janis mask as he was arrested by police. Bloody Halloween incident at the mansion of young politician Justin Richard flashed across screens as headlines broke the news. In a small apartment in the heart of the city, a group of students gathered in the cramped living room. They were discussing the current political situation, endless corruption, unkept political promises, and the worsening conditions for ordinary people. Their conversation abruptly stopped when one of them turned on the television, and they saw the live report from the Halloween party that had descended into chaos. Their faces froze, eyes glued to the screen, showing Barney being arrested, still wearing the Janis mask. The atmosphere, once filled with debates and arguments, shifted into a moment of reflection. One by one, they exchanged glances, a heavy question hanging in the air. "Is this what will happen to all of us?" one of them asked quietly, his voice barely audible over the sound of the television. "Will we also end up like that, angry, frustrated, until we explode?" Another shook their head, but no one was truly certain of the answer. They all knew that what they were witnessing on the screen was not just an individual tragedy. It was a reflection of the simmering anger beneath the surface. Anger directed at a system that felt increasingly broken, at politicians and business people who kept enriching themselves while the common people were pushed further to the margins. "Is it possible that violence and radical actions are the only way?" another student asked, their voice hesitant but filled with tension. Silence fell again as the question hung in the air. They weren't ready to provide an answer, but they couldn't ignore it either. The image of Barney on the screen became a symbol for them, not as a hero, but as someone who had been pushed to the point of destruction, a point where words were no longer enough. The news continued to roll across the screen, showing brief interviews with eyewitnesses, footage of the police securing the scene, and images of victims being evacuated from the location. What should have been a night of games and masks had turned into a stark reminder that beneath every mask, there is a fury waiting to erupt at any moment. In that small apartment, the group of students continued to reflect, wondering whether they too would follow the same path, or if they could find another way to fight the never-ending injustice.